My husband announced at breakfast that he had accepted a job in London and expected me to quit my career and follow him. "You're my wife. Of course you're coming," he said, like the decision had never belonged to me. I buttered my toast and asked whether he wanted the good news or the bad news first. He laughed and told me I was being dramatic, so I slid an envelope across the table. Inside was my new employment contract, signed 3 days earlier, along with a photograph of the office waiting for me in New York. He stopped laughing before he even finished reading the first page. I used to believe that marriage meant making decisions together, not agreeing on everything, not asking permission for every little thing, just understanding that when a decision changed both people's lives, neither person got to make it alone. My husband, Graham Whitmore, apparently had a different definition. We had been married for 11 years, long enough that I knew the sound of his footsteps before he entered a room, the particular silence that meant he was irritated, and the way he rubbed the bridge of his nose whenever he was about to tell me something he had already decided I would accept. What I didn't know was how long he had been making decisions about my life without me. Graham worked in corporate finance for a multinational consulting firm in Chicago. I was a senior contracts attorney for a medical technology company called Halcyon Biomedical. Our careers had always existed alongside each other, occasionally competing for time, but never, I thought, for importance. That illusion began to crack one Tuesday morning. We were sitting across from each other at our kitchen island. The coffee machine was still humming behind me, and I was halfway through reading an email from my general counsel when Graham casually said, "I've accepted a position in London." I looked up. He didn't. He was spreading marmalade across his toast like he'd just told me he'd ordered new curtains. "London? London. When did this happen?" "Last week." Something in my stomach tightened. "Last week?" He finally looked at me. I wanted to be sure before I brought it up. Brought it up, not discussed it, not talked to me about it. Brought it up like a weather forecast. He explained the offer: 2 years, better pay, a path to partnership, an apartment the company would provide. Then, without pausing for breath, he said, "We'll probably leave in 6 weeks." 6 weeks? Yes. "And what exactly do you mean by we?" He smiled like the answer was obvious. "You're my wife. Of course you're coming." I asked what he expected me to do about my job. He shrugged and told me to take a break, look for something over there, work remotely for a while. I reminded him I wasn't even licensed to practice law in England. "We'll figure it out," he said, like I was the one being unreasonable. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I buttered my toast and asked him whether he wanted the good news or the bad news first. He laughed. Actually laughed. "You've been watching too many courtroom dramas?" He had no idea what was sitting in my work bag upstairs. An envelope. One he hadn't earned the right to see yet. If you've ever sat across from someone who assumed your answer before they even asked the question, you already know exactly how this feels. Stay with her. Some of us needed to hear this story. The days after that breakfast moved strangely for me. Graham grew more certain by the hour. I watched it happen the way you watch weather roll in slow, then all at once. By Wednesday, he was telling people at his office. I found out because his assistant sent me a calendar invite by mistake, titled Whitmore Family Relocation Logistics Call. Family relocation. As if I'd already signed something. By Thursday, he was scrolling through apartment listings at the dinner table, turning his phone toward me every few minutes like I was supposed to be impressed. A converted flat near Regent's Park. A newer building in Kensington with a gym on the ground floor. He talked about neighborhoods the way other people talk about vacations, not moves that required me to abandon 11 years of professional standing. I nodded. I asked reasonable questions. I let him believe I was adjusting. What he didn't notice, what he never seemed to notice, was that I wasn't asking anything about my own job. Not once did he ask how Halcyon would handle my absence. Not once did he ask what happened to a contracts attorney with a decade of case history who couldn't simply pick up her license and walk across an ocean. To Graham, my career had always been a detail, something that existed conveniently around the edges of his. He believed, truly believed, that a wife's work was elastic, that it stretched and folded itself into whatever shape his opportunities required. He said it outright on Friday night, half joking, half not. "You've always been able to figure things out. That's one of the things I love about you." I smiled and said thank you. What I was thinking was something else entirely. I kept going to work. I kept my calendar full. I kept my voice steady every time he mentioned London like it was already decided, already real, already mine to accept. He thought my silence meant I was catching up to his plan. He had no idea I was already 3 steps ahead of it, and that the woman he assumed would follow him anywhere had already stopped asking for his permission weeks ago. I need to go back a little further, because none of this started at that breakfast table. It started 3 weeks before, with a message from a woman I hadn't heard from in almost a year. Priya Shah and I used to work in the same building, back when she was at Graham's firm before switching companies. We weren't close anymore, just the occasional message on birthdays. So when she texted asking to meet privately, I knew it wasn't small talk. We sat in a corner booth at a cafe near her office. She kept turning her coffee cup in slow circles before she finally looked at me. "I don't know if this is my place," she said, "but I'd want someone to tell me." Then she told me something that didn't fit anywhere in the version of my marriage I thought I understood. Graham had been talking about London for 4 months. Not weeks, months. She said he'd mentioned it casually in meetings, the way people mention plans that are already settled. And when someone had asked about his wife's career, Graham had said I was flexible. That my company had offices overseas and I'd probably just transfer. Like I was inventory. Like my 10 years at Halcyon, my bar license, my entire professional identity could be packed into a shipping container labeled spouse. I sat there nodding, thanking her for telling me, keeping my face arranged into something calm. But underneath the table my hands had gone still, in a way that felt less like composure and more like shock, trying to find somewhere to land. 4 months. He had looked me in the eye at that kitchen island and said last week like it was the truth. I didn't confront him that night. I didn't confront him the next night either. I just started paying attention differently to what he said, and more importantly, to what he'd stopped bothering to say to me at all. A week after I spoke with Priya, I sat down at our home computer to pay a utility bill and found Graham's email account still open from the night before. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that, and I wasn't the kind of wife who searched through her husband's messages, but there it was, sitting in his inbox, a subject line that made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Whitmore relocation timeline. It was from a relocation consultant. Professional, clipped, the kind of email written by someone used to moving other people's lives around like furniture. One sentence stopped me completely. "We can structure the move around your spouse's resignation timeline. Once she resigns, the London assignment becomes much easier to finalize." I read it twice, then a third time, slower, like rereading it might change what it said. Not your wife's preferences, not your family's schedule. My resignation timeline. Mine. As though my career's ending was a line item in someone else's spreadsheet, a box that simply needed checking before the real plan could move forward. I sat there for a long time after that, the cursor blinking on a browser tab I no longer cared about, and then the smaller things started coming back to me, one after another, like puzzle pieces I'd been holding upside down. The way Graham had started asking about my savings account balance, casual, offhand, over dinner. The comment 3 months ago, "You seem like you're burning out." You know that I'd taken as concern instead of what it might actually have been. The sudden insistence, out of nowhere, that we should consolidate our finances into one account for simplicity. The way he'd started calling my job your current thing, like it was a phase instead of a career I had built for over a decade. None of it had felt like anything at the time. Small comments, ordinary marriage noise. But laid next to that email, they didn't look ordinary anymore. They looked like preparation, like someone building a case, one quiet sentence at a time, for a version of me who would simply agree. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady. My mind wasn't. Because I was no longer asking myself if I was imagining things. I was starting to ask what else he'd been planning without me. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from doubting your own memory. That's where I was, sitting at my desk after work with the door closed, wondering if I'd built an entire betrayal out of one email and one uncomfortable conversation with Priya. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Graham really had just misspoken about the timeline. Maybe the resignation sentence meant something else entirely. I needed to know, not to leave him, not yet. I just needed to know if I was losing my grip on what was real, or if my husband had actually been building a plan around me without ever including me in it. So I started keeping a folder. It sounds almost clinical when I say it that way, but that's exactly what it was. A digital folder, password protected, saved somewhere Graham would never think to look. Screenshots of the calendar invite his assistant had accidentally sent me. A copy of the relocation consultant's email, the one with that sentence I couldn't stop rereading. Notes with dates and times, written the way I used to draft case files at work, factual, unemotional. Nothing I couldn't defend if someone asked me to prove it. I told myself this was due diligence. The same instinct that made me a good attorney was the instinct telling me to gather the facts before I trusted my own conclusions. 2 weeks into keeping that folder, I found the document that changed everything. It was sitting in Graham's downloads folder on our shared home computer, a PDF he'd forgotten to move or delete. A preliminary valuation report for our house. Our house, the one we'd bought together 9 years ago, the one with both our names on the deed, the one I had never once discussed selling. Attached to the report was a short note from the real estate contact. Casual, familiar. The kind of note you write to someone you've already spoken with more than once. Confirmed with Graham that his wife is fully supportive of listing, moving forward with next steps. Fully supportive. I read that sentence the way you read something in a language you're only half fluent in, waiting for the words to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. They didn't. I hadn't spoken to a single real estate agent. I hadn't agreed to sell anything. I hadn't even been asked. That was the night fear stopped being the loudest thing in the room. Something colder was starting to take its place. I want to tell you exactly what it feels like to stop trusting your own husband's paperwork. It feels like standing in your own kitchen and realizing you no longer know which drawers are safe to open. After the valuation report, I stopped asking myself why Graham would do this. I started asking a much more dangerous question: what else had he done that I hadn't found yet? I didn't have the skills to answer that on my own, so I did something that felt strange even as I was doing it. I hired a forensic accountant. Her name was Marisol Bennett, and a colleague at Halcyon had used her once during a messy corporate dispute and described her as someone who could make terrifying numbers sound almost boring, which, as it turns out, is exactly the kind of person you want when your own life is the thing under review. I met her at her office on a Thursday afternoon, telling myself the entire drive over that this was simply due diligence, not a declaration of war, not the beginning of the end of my marriage. Just a woman with a law degree making sure she understood her own finances before any major life decision. That's the story I told myself anyway. Marisol was calm in a way that put me at ease immediately. She asked practical questions, access to joint account statements, mortgage documents, investment records, anything with both our names attached. I gave her copies of everything I could gather without raising Graham's suspicion, which, given how distracted he'd become with London, wasn't difficult at all. This might be nothing, she told me before I left. Most of the time, it is nothing. I wanted to believe her. For 11 days I heard nothing, and I almost convinced myself that nothing was exactly what she'd find. I went back to my routine work, dinner, small talk with Graham about apartment listings I no longer had the patience to pretend to care about. I kept documenting. I kept waiting. Then, on a Tuesday evening, my phone rang while I was still at the office. "I found something," Marisol said. No preamble, no small talk. "Small transfers, regular ones, going back about 18 months. I sat very still in my chair. "Transfers to where?" There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me she'd already double-checked this before calling me, that she wasn't guessing. "An account I don't recognize yet," she said, "but I will." I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in my empty office long after everyone else had gone home. 18 months. Long before London had ever been mentioned to me, my husband had already been quietly moving pieces into place. Some phone calls change the shape of your entire marriage in under 5 minutes. This was one of them. Marisol asked me to come in person this time, which told me before I even sat down that whatever she'd found was bigger than a phone call could hold. She had documents spread across her desk in neat, deliberate rows, the way I used to lay out exhibits before a hearing. She walked me through it slowly. The transfers she'd mentioned on the phone, 18 months of them, small enough that our joint bank hadn't flagged anything, large enough that they added up to a number that made my throat tighten. All of it had funneled into a single account. That account belonged to a holding company I'd never heard of, something with a generic name that told you nothing about what it actually held. "And what does it hold?" I asked. Marisol turned a page toward me. A property record. An address in London. I stared at it for a long moment before I could make myself ask the next question. "Is it his?" "Not exactly," she said. "Then whose name is on the deed?" She didn't answer right away, and something about her hesitation told me I wasn't going to like what came next. "His mother's." I sat back in my chair. The room didn't spin exactly, but something in my chest did. This wasn't about a job offer. It had never been about a job offer. Graham hadn't been offered a 2-year assignment that happened to come with an apartment the company would provide. He had been building something for himself, quietly, for a year and a half, routing money into property that had nothing to do with any employer's relocation package and everything to do with a life he intended to have whether I came along or not. And he had done it in his mother's name, which meant even if I found it, even if I asked, there would be nothing with his signature on it, nothing that pointed directly back to him. I thanked Marisol and left her office with copies of everything folded carefully into my bag. Walking to my car, I realized something that steadied me more than it should have. Graham didn't know I had this. For the first time since that Tuesday breakfast, I understood something he didn't, and I intended to keep it that way for as long as it served me. I didn't expect the next call to come from Nathan. Graham's younger brother had never been warm toward me, not in 11 years, not once. So when he texted asking if we could meet, I assumed it had something to do with a birthday or a holiday I'd forgotten. I wasn't prepared for how tired he looked when I found him at the coffee shop, or how long he sat there turning his cup in circles before he spoke, the same nervous habit I'd watched Priya do weeks earlier. "I shouldn't be telling you this," he finally said. "Then don't," I told him, even though every part of me wanted him to. He didn't listen. Something in him needed to say it more than I needed to hear it, apparently, because he kept going anyway. "Graham thinks you're going to ruin everything," he said. "The London deal, the partnership, the house, all of it." I asked him what he meant by ruin. Nathan looked down at the table before he answered, like he already knew this next part would land harder than the last. "He's been telling people you're unstable," he said. "That you're obsessed with work. That if the move affects your career, you're going to become unreasonable about it." I sat very still. Not because it was surprising exactly, I'd already found the money, the property, the sentence about my resignation timeline, but there's a difference between suspecting your husband is planning around you and hearing out loud that he's been quietly rewriting who you are to the people whose opinions matter to him. Obsessed with work, as if a decade of building a career made me difficult instead of dedicated, likely to become unreasonable, a phrase designed so that anything I said later, any resistance at all, would already look exactly like the thing he'd warned everyone I would become. He hadn't just been planning a life without asking me. He had been laying the groundwork so that when I finally objected, I wouldn't look like a wife defending her career. I would look like the problem he'd predicted all along. I thanked Nathan for telling me, and though thank you felt like the wrong word for what I actually felt, and I drove home in silence, replaying every polite smile I'd given Graham's coworkers over the years, every dinner where I'd laughed at their jokes and asked about their families. He hadn't just made a decision about my future. He had already built a story where I was the villain for objecting to it, and he had no idea that I now knew exactly what he'd been saying, or that I was done being surprised by him. Something changes in you the moment you stop needing someone to admit the truth. That's what happened to me after Nathan's confession. I stopped asking Graham questions I already knew the answers to. I stopped giving him openings to explain himself because every explanation he'd given me so far had been a rehearsed one, smooth and ready, like he'd practiced it in the shower before he ever said it out loud to me. So I got quiet. Not sad quiet. Not the kind of silence that comes from a woman losing her fight. This was something else, something more deliberate, the kind of calm you choose because you've realized the only person confrontation ever benefits is the one who saw it coming. Graham noticed. He just didn't understand what he was noticing. He'd bring up London at dinner, and instead of pushing back, I'd nod and ask a small, ordinary question about the neighborhood or the flight schedule. He'd mention his parents again, how proud they were, how ready everyone was for this next chapter, and I'd simply agree that it sounded like a big step. He mistook my calm for surrender. I could see it in the way his shoulders relaxed a little more each week, the way his voice got looser and more certain, like a man who believed he'd already won an argument no one else remembered having. I made an appointment with a family law attorney named Evelyn Hart during my lunch break, telling my assistant it was a dentist appointment. Evelyn had a way of looking at you that made you feel like your situation was neither dramatic nor unusual, just a puzzle with pieces that needed sorting. I told her everything. The email, the valuation report, the holding company, Nathan's confession. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said the sentence that would carry me through everything that came after. "You don't need to prove that your husband is a villain," she told me. "You need to understand what he's done, what you own, what you can protect, and what decisions still belong to you." I wrote that down on the notepad in my bag, word for word, like a client instruction I couldn't afford to forget. Because that was the moment I stopped trying to catch Graham in a lie. I started building something he didn't know existed. If you've ever gone quiet around someone instead of exploding, not because you were weak, but because you were finally thinking clearly for the first time in months, I think you already understand exactly where this story is going. Tell me in the comments if you've been there. While Graham grew louder, I grew quieter. And for the first time, I understood that those two things were not opposites. They were a trade. I accepted the New York position the following week. I didn't tell a single person outside of Halcyon's HR department, not even the assistant who'd once helped me draft my own employment contracts for other people. I negotiated my start date to give myself room to maneuver. I found temporary housing near the office, paid for out of an account Graham didn't know I'd opened. I moved my personal savings, slowly, in amounts small enough not to draw attention, into a space that belonged only to me. I kept going to work every day like nothing in my life had changed at all. Meanwhile, Graham's confidence became something closer to performance. He showed coworkers photos of the London flat on his phone, scrolling through rooms like he was giving a tour of a home he'd already moved into. He introduced me to friends at a dinner party that week with a phrase that landed harder than he could have known. "Nora's all sorted," he said, one hand resting on my shoulder like I was a decision he'd already finalized. "She's figuring out the remote work situation." I smiled at the table. I let him have that moment because I understood something he didn't, that every confident sentence he said in front of witnesses was one more thing he'd have to explain later when the truth caught up to him. I wasn't reacting to his plan anymore. I was building mine, quietly, one signature and one quiet phone call at a time, while he stood in the middle of a life he thought was already settled. Then Evelyn called on a Thursday evening while I was still at my temporary apartment, going over lease paperwork by lamplight. "I found something in the property documents," she said, and I could hear the careful weight in her voice, the tone of someone who'd already read a thing twice before deciding how to say it to me. "The London property isn't just tied to Graham's mother. There's a loan attached to it." "Okay," I said slowly. "And part of the collateral," Evelyn continued, "appears to involve assets connected to your marriage." I sat down on the edge of the unfamiliar bed in my temporary apartment, the lease papers slipping from my lap. If Graham moved forward with this relocation under the terms he'd already been negotiating, I could end up legally tied to obligations I had never agreed to, never signed for, never even known existed. For 11 years, I had believed the biggest risk in my marriage was losing Graham. I was only now beginning to understand what I actually stood to lose if I stayed silent one day longer. There is a specific kind of danger in a man who believes he's already won. That was Graham that week. Every conversation carried the ease of someone who thought the hard part was behind him, that whatever resistance I might have had was something he'd successfully waited out. We were folding laundry on a Sunday afternoon, something ordinary and domestic, when he said it without even looking up from the shirt he was folding. "You'll probably miss your colleagues," he said, "but you'll adjust. Not if this happens. Not when we figure this out together. You'll adjust," spoken like a fact about the weather, something already settled and simply waiting for me to catch up to. I kept folding. "Probably," I said. He smiled, encouraged by my agreement, and kept going. "I told my parents you're moving," he added, like it was a small detail, an afterthought worth mentioning between towels. "They're thrilled! My mom's already talking about visiting once we're settled." I didn't ask when he'd told them. I didn't need to. I already knew, in the way you know a pattern once you've seen it enough times, that he'd told them before he'd told me anything real, the same way he'd told his coworkers, the same way he'd told the relocation consultant, the same way he'd apparently told half of Chicago that his wife was flexible, adjustable, sortable. "Probably," I said again, and I smiled. He had no idea what that smile actually cost me to hold in place. He had no idea it wasn't agreement. It was patience. It was the particular calm of a woman who had already read the loan documents, already signed a contract 3 time zones away, already met with an attorney who was, at that very moment, working through the financial trap his own paperwork had built. Graham believed my silence was compliance. He believed the 11 years behind us had trained me into someone who would fold herself into whatever shape his opportunities required. He wasn't entirely wrong that I'd been trained. He was wrong about what the training had actually taught me. Because somewhere between the valuation report in the holding company and Nathan's confession in that coffee shop, I had stopped being a woman waiting for her husband to include her. I had become a woman quietly preparing for the moment he'd finally understand he never had. Evelyn's next phone call came on a Tuesday morning, and it was the kind of call that made me close my office door before I answered. "I need you to sit down," she said, which is never a sentence you want to hear from your own attorney. She walked me through what she'd found in the loan documents attached to the London property, the property still sitting quietly in Graham's mother's name, still funded by 18 months of transfers he thought no one had noticed. The loan itself wasn't the problem. The collateral was. Part of it, Evelyn explained, touched assets connected to our marriage. Not directly in my name, not obviously, but entangled enough that if Graham finalized the relocation under the terms he'd already been negotiating, I could find myself legally bound to obligations I had never agreed to and never even known existed. He's been building this for a year and a half, Evelyn said, and every version of it assumes your cooperation without ever asking for it. I asked her what I should do. Nothing yet, she said. Let him keep talking. Every sentence he says right now, every plan he describes to you or anyone else, becomes part of the record of what he believed and when he believed it. Don't confront him, not until you're protected. So I waited. That same week, I signed my New York contract. Not the preliminary offer I'd accepted weeks earlier, but the finalized version, the one with my new title, my new salary, my start date locked into place. I read every clause the way I'd trained myself to read contracts for a living, and when I signed my name at the bottom, my hand didn't shake at all. 3 days later, I sat down across from Graham at our kitchen island, the same island where this entire story had started weeks earlier, though he had no idea we'd already circled back to that exact moment. The coffee machine hummed behind me. He was spreading marmalade across his toast. I've accepted a position in London, he said, like it was new information, like he hadn't been discussing it with strangers for 4 months before he ever said a word to me. I looked up at him. He didn't look up at me. When did this happen? I asked, though of course I already knew the real answer, the one buried in Priya's warning and Marisol's spreadsheets and the loan documents sitting in Evelyn's office. Last week, he said. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I finally understood, completely and without a single doubt left in me, exactly what kind of man I had married and exactly how little he understood about the woman sitting across from him. Some mornings don't feel like the ones that will change your life. This one did, though it wore the disguise of an ordinary Tuesday. Graham kept talking, laying out the details like he was presenting a project at work. The apartment, the neighborhood, the relocation allowance. He described the timeline as though it had already been approved by both of us, as though I'd been in the room for every decision that built it. We'll probably leave in 6 weeks, he said. I let him finish. I'd learned over the past several weeks that letting a person finish gives you more information than interrupting ever does. When he got to the part where he explained, again, that I'd figure out my career situation once we landed, I set down my coffee cup and looked at him directly. Do you want the good news or the bad news first? He laughed. Actually laughed. The same easy laugh I remembered from that very first morning, except this time I understood something about it I hadn't understood then. It wasn't affection. It was dismissal, dressed up as charm. You've been watching too many courtroom dramas, he said. I smiled and said nothing else. I stood up, rinsed my cup in the sink like nothing unusual was happening, and walked upstairs without another word. The envelope had been sitting in my desk drawer for 3 days, waiting for a moment I hadn't fully decided on until just now. I picked it up and felt the weight of it in my hand, thin paper carrying more consequence than anything else in that entire house. I walked back downstairs. Graham was still at the island, scrolling through his phone, probably another apartment listing, probably another life he'd already half moved into without me. I set the envelope on the counter between us. He looked at it, then at me. What is this? The good news, I said. Something flickered across his face, brief and unreadable, gone before I could name it. He picked up the envelope slowly, like he already sensed it wasn't going to be what he expected, though nothing in his expression yet suggested he understood how much his entire understanding of our marriage was about to shift. He opened it. I watched his eyes move across the first page, then the second, then the third, watched the particular stillness come over him that I recognized from 11 years of marriage, the stillness that meant he was recalculating everything in real time, trying to fit new information into a story that no longer made sense. I didn't say anything. I'd waited weeks to stop explaining myself to a man who'd never once thought to explain himself to me. Now it was his turn to sit in the silence I'd been living in for months and figure out all on his own exactly what it meant. His smile disappeared first, then his color. When did this happen? He asked, and his voice had lost every trace of the ease it carried 5 minutes earlier. 3 days ago, I said. He looked up at me, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I watched genuine confusion move across his face, the expression of a man realizing the story he'd been telling himself had a hole in it he'd never bothered to check. "You accepted this without telling me?" I held his gaze. "You accepted London without telling me." The silence that followed had weight to it, the kind you could almost lean against. He started talking fast then, the way people do when they're trying to out-argue a fact instead of address it. He said it wasn't the same thing. He said his opportunity was temporary, career-defining, the kind of chance that didn't come twice. He said husbands and wives made sacrifices for each other, that this was simply what marriage required. "So you're choosing your job over your marriage?" he said, and I could hear, underneath the accusation, the same old assumption dressed in new words, that any choice I made for myself was automatically a betrayal of him. I took a slow breath before I answered. "No," I said. "I'm choosing not to let you make my choices for me." He opened his mouth to respond, and I didn't let him. "I know about the London property," I said. "The one in your mother's name. The one you've been funding for 18 months with transfers you thought no one would notice." His face went pale in a way I'd never seen before. "I know about the loan attached to it," I continued, "and the collateral tied to assets from our marriage that you never once discussed with me. I know you told the relocation consultant I was flexible. I know you told the real estate agent I was fully supportive of selling our house, a house I never agreed to sell. And I know exactly what you've been telling your business partners about me, that I'm obsessed with work, that I'd become unreasonable, that I might ruin everything you'd already decided on your own." He didn't speak. He just stared at me, the envelope still open in his hands, the New York contract sitting between us like a verdict. "4 months," I said. "You knew about London for 4 months before you ever mentioned it to me. And in that time you built an entire narrative where any objection I made would already look exactly like the thing you'd warned everyone I'd become." "Nora," he started, but there was nothing steady left in his voice. "You didn't want a partner," I said, and this part came out quieter, though not weaker. "You wanted someone who would validate whatever life you'd already chosen without her." He tried one more angle, softer this time, almost pleading. He said he loved me. He said none of this meant what I thought it meant. He said we could talk about it, figure it out together, like togetherness was something he could summon now that being caught required it. I looked at him for a long moment, at the man I'd shared 11 years with, at the version of him I used to believe understood what commitment actually meant. "We're not done talking," I said, "but we're done doing this your way." For the first time since that Tuesday morning weeks ago, Graham didn't have an answer ready. And for the first time in longer than that, I wasn't waiting for one. 3 days after that morning at the kitchen island, Graham tried one last time. He showed up at my temporary apartment unannounced, and when I opened the door, he looked smaller somehow, like the confidence I'd watched him wear for 11 years had finally slipped off him completely. He talked about our marriage, about everything we'd built, about how 11 years didn't deserve to end over a misunderstanding. He said he'd been under pressure, that he'd handled it badly, that he never meant to make me feel like my career didn't matter. I let him finish. I'd gotten good at letting people finish. "I'm not interested in destroying you, Graham," I said. "I never was." Relief moved across his face, quick and hopeful, like he thought that sentence meant something it didn't. "But I'm also not interested in going back to a marriage where you get to decide my future and I'm just expected to catch up," I continued. "If there's a version of us that survives this, it looks completely different from the one you built without me. Every decision from now on gets made by both of us, or it doesn't get made at all." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think he expected me to offer any version of a future at all, and in a strange way, I think that surprised him more than anything else I'd said. I didn't need revenge. I understood that clearly now, standing in the doorway of an apartment that belonged only to me. Revenge would have meant I still needed something from him, his regret, his humiliation, some final proof that he'd lost. But I didn't need proof anymore. I already knew what I knew. I started my position in New York 2 weeks later. My new office looked out over a street full of people who had no idea what it had taken to get me there, and I found I didn't need them to know. The satisfaction wasn't in anyone witnessing my win. It was simply in being the one who got to decide, finally, what my own life looked like next. Graham and I are still working through what comes after this. Some days it means conversations, other days it means silence and lawyers and the slow, careful math of separating a life we spent over a decade building together. I don't know yet how it ends. I'm not sure that part matters as much as I once thought it did. What matters is this. He believed for 11 years that being my husband gave him the authority to decide my future for me. He wasn't cruel enough to think he was doing anything wrong. That's what made it so easy for him to do it in the first place. He was simply the last person in that marriage to figure out that he was wrong. I was just the first person brave enough to make sure he found out. If this story made you feel something recognized, understood, a little more sure of your own worth, that's exactly the kind of story we tell here. Subscribe to Velvet Novel, because the next woman finding her way back to herself is waiting for you too.